Today, hundreds of kakapo parrots live in New Zealand. The kakapo is a parrot so large it can't even fly. They are monitored almost like a space crew. Each bird has a name, a microchip, and its own personal history. Scientists know where it sleeps, what it eats, and when it last visited a feeding station. The kakapo is still a rare species, but it's no longer on the brink of extinction. Looking at them now, it's hard to believe that just half a century ago, their future was hanging by a thread. After long expeditions through the New Zealand wilderness, researchers were only able to find a mere 18 kakapo. Not 80, not a few hundred, but just 18 birds in the entire country. And then came the most terrible discovery. All 18 of them turned out to be males. Not a single female, not a single chance for the species to continue. Technically, the species still existed, but it had no future. How could anyone even talk about saving the species after that? And yet, it was these 18 males that became the beginning of a population that today numbers more than 230 birds. The only question is, what had to happen over the next half century for the impossible to truly become a reality? To understand how the kakapo got into such a predicament, it's worth remembering where this unusual bird came from. A heavy, green parrot that barely flies and walks calmly on the ground seems like a mistake of nature. Millions of years ago, this way of life was a successful one for it. New Zealand existed separately from other continents for a long time. There were almost no land predators here that would force birds to flee or take to the air. Flight gradually stopped being a matter of survival, and the need to maintain this ability disappeared on its own. It might have seemed that in such a world, the kakapo had no enemies at all. In reality, one dangerous predator did exist. The Haast's eagle, a giant bird of prey now completely wiped from the face of the earth, once hunted over the forests of New Zealand. This predator hunted in a completely different way than modern predatory animals. It attacked from above and relied primarily on its sight. Therefore, the birds developed a different defense strategy. Not to run, not to fly, but to freeze in time and become invisible among the dense vegetation. Over time, the kakapo began to forage for food mainly at night. Its coloring, stillness, and habit of hiding helped it survive encounters with its only serious enemy, time and time again for thousands of generations. Everything changed with the arrival of humans. Along with people, animals that had never existed here before came to the islands. They hunted by completely different rules, and that's when the kakapo's ancient defense failed for the first time. The kakapo has one trait that hadn't caused any problems for millions of years. The bird has a strong, sweet, musky scent that helped it find others of its kind in the dense night forest. For new predators, this same scent became an almost ready-made trail. A cat no longer needed to search for the motionless bird with its eyes among the ferns. It could smell it long before it could see it. The habit of freezing, which had saved the kakapo from attacks from above for so long, suddenly turned into a deadly trap. The disappearance began so quickly that, for a long time, people didn't understand its true scale. One day, the kakapo was still considered a common forest bird. Then sightings of it became a rarity. Soon, researchers had to go on multi-day expeditions for a single chance to see just one bird. One of the first people to understand the danger was a man named Richard Henry. Back in the late 19th century, he came to a conclusion that seemed insane. If the kakapo couldn't live safely alongside introduced predators, then it needed to be moved to a place where there were no predators. Over several years, Richard Henry personally moved more than 200 kakapo to Resolution Island, which at the time was considered a safe haven for rare birds. The effort was colossal, but the hope was short-lived because the island turned out to be not as safe as they thought. Just 6 years later, stoats made their way to the island and almost completely wiped out the new kakapo population. But the idea of moving the birds to predator-free islands survived this failure. Decades later, it was this very idea that became the foundation for the entire operation to save the species. By the middle of the last century, it became clear that previous attempts were no longer enough. New Zealand specialists began one search expedition after another, heading into the country's most remote areas, in search of at least one living bird. The search went on for almost a quarter of a century. More than 60 expeditions took place, and almost everyone ended the same way. They constantly found signs of the birds, but almost never the kakapo themselves, and they were unable to keep the 6 birds they did catch alive in captivity. All 6 turned out to be males, and almost all of them died just a few months after being captured. People still knew way too little about the kakapo's way of life to help them survive away from their native forest. On the surface, it all looked like an endless string of failures. Years passed, more and more effort was poured in, but the results hardly changed. However, it was these very expeditions that laid the groundwork for a discovery that would soon bring talk of hope back again. In 1974, New Zealand scientists began a new search, even though they weren't sure the species still existed. Over the next few years, 18 kakapo were found in the mountains of Fiordland, and all of them, once again, turned out to be male. The species wasn't formally considered extinct, but there was simply no one for these males to continue the line with. This is exactly the kind of moment we talked about at the very beginning of this story. Only back then, the scientists didn't know what would happen next. One of the males was caught in 1975 in a mountain valley in Fiordland and was named Richard Henry, in honor of the man who first tried to save the kakapo back in the century before last. The bird was moved to Maud Island. By all accounts, this male turned out to be the last surviving member of a once large mainland population. The bird was already very old by that time, but researchers would only realize just how important his appearance was many years later. The specialists' attention was focused on another issue. If only males were left in the mountains, there was almost no time. And yet, just a couple of years later, a discovery was made that completely changed the course of this story. In 1977 on Stewart Island, scientists discovered another population of kakapo, much larger than the previous one. But the main thing wasn't the numbers. Among these birds, there were finally females, and not just males. For the first time in many decades, the species had a real chance at a future. This discovery could have put an end to the story of the kakapo's extinction. But it very quickly became clear that the last females were not living in a safe place at all. Stewart Island had long been shared with feral cats. According to scientists' calculations, in certain years, cats killed up to 56% of the adult birds annually. This created a terrible contradiction. The species had finally found a future, but it could lose it all again in a single season. Waiting was not an option. Starting in 1982, all the kakapo that were found began to be moved one by one to islands completely cleared of predators. Over 15 years, 65 birds were moved there, 43 males and 22 females. That's how an operation began that continues to this day. It was no longer about a few rescue expeditions, but about a continuous effort that has stretched on for more than 40 years. But it very quickly became clear that predators were far from the only problem. Once upon a time, another large, flightless bird lived in New Zealand, the moa. It too had been doing just fine on the islands for millions of years. But after humans arrived, it disappeared in just a few centuries, and bringing it back was already impossible. The kakapo story could have ended the exact same way. The difference came down to just one event. Researchers managed to find the second population before cats completely wiped it out. It was this small window of time that gave the species a chance the moa never had. It seemed like the worst was now behind them. The males and females were finally safe, with no more predators around. It was logical to expect that their numbers would immediately start to grow rapidly, but the specialists ran into a new mystery. Years went by and the number of birds only grew slightly. Then the researchers started looking for the cause, not in the kakapo's environment, but within the birds themselves. The answer turned out to be so unusual that it immediately became clear why the species was recovering so slowly. Unlike most parrots, kakapos hardly ever form permanent pairs. The males gather in specific areas and attract females with a loud, booming sound, similar to a drumbeat, and then each bird goes back to living on its own. Scientists call this behavior lek mating, a rare courtship method among parrots. For this reason alone, it was hard to expect rapid population growth. But the species' main peculiarity was hidden somewhere else entirely, in a much less obvious place. Kakapos don't produce offspring every year. They only breed when the rimu tree has a particularly bountiful fruit harvest, and such seasons are rare, happening roughly once every 2, 3, or even 4 years. This created a strange contradiction. All the conditions for their salvation had been met. The birds were safe, and there were males and females nearby. But nature itself was in no hurry to help people, and for several years in a row, not a single chick might hatch. But after a successful season, everything would change almost instantly. The population didn't grow a little bit each year, it would increase in sudden bursts, and then stagnate again for a long time. That's why from the outside it looked as if the conservation program was barely getting any results. The real test for the program came later, and it was no less serious, although completely different in nature. Even after relocating them to safe islands, the fate of the species remained extremely fragile for a long time to come. By 1995, there were only 51 kakapo left in the entire world, 31 males and 20 females. That was when the conservation program, which continues to this day, officially began. From that moment on, each individual bird was no longer just a part of the population, but became valuable in its own right. The kakapo started being monitored almost as closely as they are today, because with such a small number, there was simply no other choice. Each kakapo was given a name, fitted with a microchip, and equipped with a radio transmitter. Now, researchers knew where every bird was, what it was eating, and if it was okay at any moment of the day or night. Constant monitoring was needed for more than just spotting illness or injury in time. It helped answer a long-standing question. Why do some birds produce offspring, while others go year after year without reproducing, even though they live under the same conditions? The answer led the experts to a new problem. Almost all the remaining kakapo turned out to be very close relatives. The smaller the population became, the more often offspring came from birds with similar genes, and this reduced the species' genetic diversity. Fortunately, among the rescued birds was a male named Richard Henry. For many years, he had lived separately from the other kakapo and belonged to a different Fiordland genetic line, which was noticeably different from the island one. In 1998, Richard Henry fathered 3 chicks with a female named Flossie on Maud Island. His offspring brought back the genetic diversity to the population that it had once seemed was lost forever. However, a later genome analysis presented an unexpected twist. Richard Henry's genes did indeed add diversity, but at the same time they carried more harmful mutations than the scientists had expected. Even his offspring did not completely escape the consequences of inbreeding. Starting in 2015, scientists began sequencing the genome of practically every living bird, as well as preserved museum specimens of the extinct mainland kakapo. This allowed for more precise matching of breeding pairs and helped preserve the species' remaining genetic diversity. However, even after this, the work didn't get any easier. In 2019, during one of the most successful breeding seasons, several kakapos suddenly came down with a severe fungal respiratory infection. A total of 21 kakapo got sick, and 9 of them died, despite constant monitoring by veterinarians. The species population dropped to 211 birds. The question once again arose whether the kakapo could even be considered saved for good. To answer it, the specialists had to find the source of the infection itself. Research and genome analysis showed that the outbreak was caused by the exact same fungal strain, which meant the disease could not only be treated, but also prevented in the future. Stories like these gradually changed the entire conservation program. It had long since stopped being the typical work of field biologists. Now, veterinarians, geneticists, and infectious disease specialists were constantly working alongside them, and they all shared one common goal. The conservation program became one of the most technologically advanced in the world of wildlife preservation. They installed smart feeders on the islands, each one opening only for a specific bird whose transmitter it recognizes, and at the same time, it automatically weighs the kakapo. Special transmitters on the males track their movements during mating season and can even recognize a mating attempt. This data helps veterinarians decide in time whether a specific pair needs artificial insemination to increase the chances of a successful clutch. Since 2019, drones have been used on the islands to deliver male sperm collected for artificial insemination. A journey that used to take several hours on foot is now covered by a drone in just a few minutes, keeping the material more viable. Scientists also tested 3D printed artificial eggs that make sounds similar to a real chick inside the shell. These decoys help the mother prepare for the arrival of her offspring, while the real egg is taken to an incubator for safekeeping. It was the combination of all these measures that gradually began to yield results. Safe islands, constant monitoring, genetic work, disease treatment, and dozens of technological solutions would have unlikely changed the situation on their own. But together, they achieved the almost impossible. Today, 236 kakapo live in New Zealand. They all live on 3 predator-free islands, Whanuaho, Pukenui, and Te Kakahu. Compared to most species, this is still a very small population. In 2026, the forest produced an exceptionally rich rimu harvest, and the breeding season became the most successful in the program's history. By April, at least 95 chicks had hatched, which broke the previous record of 73 chicks. Back in 2023, several birds were returned to mainland New Zealand for the first time in many decades, to the protected sanctuary of Maunga Tautari. This was the first step toward bringing the kakapo back to a place where the species had almost completely disappeared. The species is still a long way from being fully self-sufficient. The kakapo are still monitored every day, but now this work is not about buying a little more time, but about one day making constant human help simply unnecessary. There's another reason why kakapo are known far beyond New Zealand. In the late 90s, a male named Sirocco hatched, who, due to a childhood illness, grew up away from other kakapo and became accustomed only to people. In 2009, during the filming of a documentary for the BBC, Sirocco unexpectedly tried to mate with the head of a zoologist who had come to film the bird for the show. The clip instantly went viral all over the world. Tens of millions of people watched the video, and for the first time, even those who had never heard of the kakapo learned about this bird. In 2010, the Prime Minister of New Zealand officially appointed Sirocco as a conservation ambassador for the species. Later, specialists tried to collect Sirocco's sperm for the breeding program using special equipment, but they were unsuccessful because the bird stubbornly chose a human head to court instead of a female. This incident drew more attention to conservation than dozens of scientific publications. Meanwhile, the program itself continued to become more precise. Scientists learned to predict which pairs would produce the healthiest offspring, when it was best to intervene in raising a chick, and when it was better to let nature take its course without human involvement. Half a century ago, 18 males with not a single female seemed more like the final page of this story than its continuation. But it was from that moment that one of the most complex and successful animal rescue programs in the history of conservation began. Today, the kakapo is still one of the rarest parrots in the world. But its story is no longer one of inevitable extinction. It's about how even the most hopeless situations can sometimes be turned around if you act in time and never give up.